one? So it's 1 o'clock. Should we start? Ready to go? Okay. Wow. Thanks for coming today to my speech. I'm Sue Riegler from the Crystal Lake Public Library, and I'd like to talk today about the history of the Crystal Lake Library. So we're going to start with a picture of what Crystal Lake looked like in 1912. This is just a year before the library was started. This is Route 14 if I'm standing on Dole Avenue looking down towards the water tower would be on our right behind all those trees, but of course it's not there. Taco Bell would be on the left down there amid all those trees. So this is a little town that we lived in 1912, 1913. This is what the beachfront would have looked like. Cars could pull right up to the lakefront and enjoy a day at the beach in the year that the library was formed. And this is the Congregational Church. At that time it was known as the Congregational Church, not the First Congregational Church. Can you see it has two entrances? Right now we have one main entrance. You go upstairs into an entrance. At that time it had two entrances. I was told one for men and one for women. I'm not sure when that was changed. And this is the article from the newspaper, November 13th, 1913. The library opened on the 15th in the Dodge family home, which is on the corner of Pomeroy Avenue and Grove Street. Mary Howe Rogers was superintendent of the Bible School of the Congregational Church on Pearson Street, and she recognized the need for a library in Crystal Lake, and she worked to create one. Some years before, Reverend John Boyd Johnston of the church organized a brotherhood class of young men. For them, he began to plan a library. When he left the church, the idea wasn't taken on, but Mary Rogers resurrected it. She opened the library in the living room of the vacant home of H.A. and Bertha Dodge. The house is on the corner, as I said, of Pomeroy and Grove. Mr. Dodge coined the phrase, Crystal Lake, a good place to live. The Dodge family was very supportive of the library and generously permitted the library to use their vacant home on Pomeroy. The living room was converted into a library with bookshelves, tables, and chairs to make a reading room for Crystal Lake citizens. The young people of the church helped raise funds for the new library, and they also assisted in the library. Mrs. Rogers was the acting librarian, and Helen Dolly was her assistant. The library was open Saturdays from 2 to 10 p.m. Dolly Lane, located a short distance from the Dodge home, was named for Helen Dolly's family. But the library did not remain in the Dodge home for long. In June of 1914, the library moved from the Dodge home to a room in the Crystal Lake High School building on Paddock Street. This is an article from the paper about Mr. Dodge. And this is what the high school looked like in Crystal Lake at that time. It has since been torn down. The school provided the library with light, heat, and janitorial service so that any monetary donations the library received could be used for books. The Bible school decided that the library should be managed by a library board, and one was selected. The Bible school from the Congregational Church then turned the library over to the library board to make it a public library, although it still was not supported by any tax dollars. Although the Bible class released control of the library, it felt, quote, it would receive it back again as part of the community, a much larger enterprise for the good. Mr. H.A. Dean, a member of the library board, was also superintendent of the public schools. A quote referring to Mr. Dean from the Crystal Lake Herald newspaper at the time said he saw the great need of a good library as well as the need for housing, and he realized, too, the value of a library close to public schools as a factor in education. By September of 1914, the library had 600 books. It had started with 200. The hours changed when the library moved from the Dodge House to the school building. It was now opened on Wednesdays from 2 to 5 and on Sundays from 3 to 6. This is a picture of the Union School, which was also on the corner of Paddock and McHenry, just a little further down from the high school building. And this is another view of Union School. This was the elementary school. The other was the high school. There was a 1-cent fine for overdue materials, and the library raised funds for new books or to repair books with annual tag days. This is a notice from the Crystal Lake Herald about a tag day that was being held, and they raised $187.30 to be used for the library. Also at that time, the paper suggested that patrons save all the lists of the books. The Herald every once in a while would print lists of what new books had come into the library, and they suggested that patrons save those lists so they'd have a complete catalog of the library's books. In 1914, another Crystal Lake Herald article of the time stated, "The new library in town is a subject of great interest to us all. Libraries make for culture, and despite the mad rush of the present day, we are all desirous of culture." At this time, Andrew Carnegie was donating libraries to many needy towns, but Mrs. Rogers related that in many instances where a Carnegie library had been given to the town, the expense of maintaining it had been such a drain on the people that they failed to get any cultural benefit. She was satisfied with leaving the library in the school building. This is an interesting picture. On the lower left-hand corner is the Union School, and above it's called the junior high because once Central High School was built in the early 20s, the old high school became a junior high. But there is actually a tunnel that ran from the Union School building to the heating plant and from the junior high building to the heating plant. So they didn't have to be up above ground in order to get from place to place. And this is approximately where Hussman Elementary School is now. By January of 1920, the library owned 2,489 books. I wanted to show you one more picture. This is the heating plant. You can see where the tunnels are leading to a heating plant. This is actually what the building looked like. By January of 1920, the library owned 24,489 books, and in 26, the library incorporated as a legal corporation. Members of the library board at the time were Willard Cobb, H.A. Dean, Clara Dyke, Fred Dolly, Bertha Dolly, A.J. Henderson, Mary Hennigan, Samuel Marsh, Lynn Richards, Carrie Dyke Teckler, and Grace Wilbur. In 1929, E.E. Dyke bequeathed $1,000 to the library. That was the largest gift it had ever received. The money was invested in a bond of the Little Rock Gas and Fuel Company to be used for the future. However, the Great Depression intervened and the bond suffered in the financial crash. When it was sold in 1933, the value received was only $373.12 of the $1,000 bond. The library spent the next 26 years in school buildings. Over time, they were moved from classroom to classroom until the schools could no longer give up a classroom due to their increasing student enrollment. The library then moved to the school heating plant building, this one. It was located behind the junior high building. The library remained in the heating plant until it had a building of its own. Mrs. Rogers continued to volunteer for the library until her death in 1935 at the age of 81. In 1937, the American Legion revealed plans to the library board to erect a building for the use of the library and for headquarters of the American Legion. The American Legion owned a parcel of land on Paddock Street, across from these schools, where they planned to build their new headquarters. However, in August of 1946, the American Legion decided to purchase the former Randall home on the corner of Oak Street and Woodstock Street. It would use this house as the American Legion headquarters. After purchasing the Randall home, the American Legion donated the lot it owned on Paddock Street, along with $2,000 to the library to be used for a new library building. The Crystal Lake Herald reported that the library should be made larger, have quarters of its own, serve more people, and in other ways be improved to keep step with the progress of the community. In 1998, the American Legion sold their headquarters on Woodstock Street to the Crystal Lake Park District, and it's now known as Park Place. In 1942, the Crystal Lake Library became the Crystal Lake Public Library, a legal public library, when the citizens of Crystal Lake voted for a library tax of 12 cents for every $100 of assessed valuation. The first board of the public library was appointed by the mayor, George Krause, and consisted of A.H. Anderson, Beatrice Dean, Helen Cohen, Harold Tober, Willa Millar, Frank Brockrogge, Judge Henry L. Cowland, Leon Lundahl, and Ralph Boyle. The library board was then able to hire a part-time manager, Joyce Krause. From the day it opened in 1913 until this time, 29 years later, the library had been run completely by volunteers. Miss Krause started on August 1st of 1942 at the salary of $60 per month. The library hours increased to 1 to 5 Monday through Saturday and 7 to 9 on Wednesday evenings. Mrs. Beatrice Wimple replaced Miss Krause. You can barely see her in the bottom photo on the left. On February 15th, 1943, Mrs. Wimple's starting salary was $901 per year. She remained librarian for 15 years. The library was still housed in the boiler plant building of the schools. In 1945, it was announced that a resident of Crystal Lake was willing to donate $12,000 toward the building of a library if that sum could be matched by a like sum. It was later revealed that the resident, who had wished to remain anonymous, was Mrs. Charles Kellogg. Mrs. Kellogg, Rose Miller Kellogg, was born on South McHenry Avenue in Crystal Lake to William and Margaret Miller. She was very civic-minded and active in her church and the Crystal Lake community. She was a longtime library supporter and felt the library needed to own its own building. Mrs. Kellogg died in October of 1955. A plaque honoring Mrs. Kellogg was dedicated after her death and can be found in the lower lobby of the current library building. The Crystal Lake Lions Club took on the task of raising the needed funds to match Mrs. Kellogg's donation. The drive for building funds was successful, and Mrs. Kellogg's donation was more than matched. A building committee was formed, but due to World War II, there was a shortage of building materials and the cost of construction was high, so they had to think of some alternatives. One considered was to add on to the junior high building, which also needed more space. It was proposed that a 52 by 35-foot library wing be added to the east side of the school building. The library would use the first floor, and the school would gain 2 classrooms on the second floor. The school would pay for heat, electric, and janitorial services for the library, and the library would pay a lease of $100 per month. With this plan, the school children wouldn't have to cross the street to get to the library. The lot donated by the American Legion could be turned into a parking lot. Unfortunately, the bids for the addition far exceeded the funds that were available, and the idea was scrapped. The library board again began to plan for a separate library building, but again, plans changed when it was discovered that the city lot, which had been a city dump at one time, was not suitable for a building. Years later, John Hussman, a teacher and principal at Central Grade School, now Hussman Elementary School, and also a library board member from 1966 to 1981, would recall seeing trucks hauling concrete and other fill into the dump at the site when Walkup Avenue was being rebuilt. The new library board decided further excavation would be needed. Construction of a new library building was finally started in early 1952, and in November 1952, it was constructed at a cost of about $30,000. This was our first library building. The dimensions were 52 feet by 27 feet, and it had 2,300 square feet of usable space. It had 2 rooms on the main level. You can see that. Two rooms on the main level and a full basement with a meeting room. The library even had 2 fireplaces, one on the main level and one on the lower level. The library moved from the school heating plant across the street into its own building. At the dedication of the building, Wayne Saggers of the Crystal Lake Lions Club said, "Let us be rightfully proud. Bigger libraries have been built, but none can surpass this library in the bigness of spirit which built it, nor in the bigness of its dedicated purpose." This is a picture of the library in use, the 1952 library. By 1958, the library had outgrown the building and needed more space, so a new children's department was created using one of the meeting rooms in the lower level. On June 1st, 1958, Mrs. Wimple retired, and Mrs. Mary Jo Hutchings had taken over as assistant. She had been Mrs. Wimple's assistant for several years, and she took over as library director. I wanted to show you a picture of what a Crystal Lake phone book looked like in those days. This is a 1957 phone book. This is Miss Mildred Flanders. She became our first children's librarian at the Crystal Lake Library. She'd recently retired from Central Grade School, which is now Hessman Elementary School, after teaching for 35 years. She was a graduate of Crystal Lake Central High School, the class of 1922. There were 36 students in her graduating class. Miss Flanders started our children's story times at the library. While Miss Flanders never had more than 25 children come to her story times, today we have 16 story times each week attended by over 200 children. Miss Flanders retired from the library in 1968 and was replaced by Mrs. Mary Ann Johns. Mrs. Johns worked in the library for 8 years before replacing Miss Flanders. Tragically, Mrs. Johns was killed in a car accident in 1970. Jan, Mrs. Steve Pollop, replaced Mrs. Johns temporarily until Nancy Myers became the head of the youth department. This is the newspaper article when Mrs. Wimple retired, and this is Mary Jo Hutchings, who took her place. During the 60s, the library collection of books doubled. Mrs. Hutchings retired, and Mrs. Patricia Kelly was hired and became head librarian in May of 1962. She's in the lower, on the left, the very left with the glasses on. Mrs. Kelly was the first full-time staff member, and the staff also included 4 part-time staff members. The population of Crystal Lake grew from 4,500 in 1952, when the library was built, to 15,000 in 1965. The library was very crowded. Further expansion was needed, and a library bond issue was approved by the citizens of Crystal Lake for $140,000. Most of the old library was raised because the floors of the building could not support the weight of the books. A new library building was constructed encompassing the old building. This is the groundbreaking for the 66 building. And here's the old library, and you can tell there's a foundation in the front. That's where the new building would be. So we moved closer to the street. The new library was constructed at a size of 80 feet by 80 feet and on 2 floors. The front door moved from paddock to the east side of the building. That's the current staff entrance now. Because of the extensive construction, the library was closed so that books could be moved. One half of the library collection was moved to temporary headquarters at Central High School. The books remained there for 6 months, but were available to be checked out by the patrons. The new building was opened in July of 1966, and a dedication ceremony was held in October 1966. That's the new building, the artist's rendition of the new building. Here's a photo of it. And this is an interior shot of the building. And another. The building cost was approximately $150,000. When the 1952 building was being torn down, it was discovered that the floor in the old building had cracked under the weight of the books and patrons in the building. The crack ran through the concrete and nearly the length of the building, but was hidden by the floor covering. Mrs. Helen Mudgett, on the right in the middle in this picture, was a staff member at the library from April 1959 to December 1970. And one of the funny things that she commented on, she remembers that police officers were often used at that time to collect overdue books. Not done any longer. In 1970, the library expanded again. This is the West Park Beach House, and we had a branch in the beach house with 2,000 books. This is Jan Pollip doing an outdoor story time at the beach house. Unfortunately, 1 year later, in July 1971, a fire completely destroyed the branch and all the books. The books were valued at $7,500, and insurance coverage paid most of the claim, but the branch was never reopened. Mrs. Kelly resigned as head librarian in February 1977 and was replaced by Mrs. Arden Perkins. Jan Pollip served as the interim head librarian for 6 months before Arden started. Arden retired in 1990. By the 1980s, the library was again short of space. In April 1983, a $1.66 million bond referendum was passed for a new 2-story addition to the library. It would add 16,800 square feet. Once the addition was completed, the library was 27,000 square feet in size. The Crystal Lake population in 1984 was 18,590. I have some pictures of these were the plans for the addition. This is what, if you're standing on the library property, what was there before the addition. This is a house that was being moved from the corner down to the corner of Oriole Trail and McHenry Avenue. Here it is on the street being moved. And this is what it looks like today. You might recognize it. It's hard to miss. So this is what the property looked like then after the addition was added on. No more houses on the corner of McHenry and Paddock. This is Ardell. This is Arden Perkins at the groundbreaking, our library director at the time. And on the left is John Cowlin at the groundbreaking. He was the library attorney at that time. This is actually construction of the addition. And there it is, almost finished. And there you can see the original building and then the addition. And past the windows, then that would be the addition. And that's what it looked like. You were standing in the lobby of the library looking out. That's an interior shot of the building. And this is the new circulation part of the library. Now you're looking back towards the 1966 building, would be on the left. In this view, you're looking through the doors would be the new addition to the library. Also in 1983, the library was awarded the Thomas Ames Trust, worth over $1 million. Thomas is on the upper right with the hat. Thomas Ames was a local farmer who died in 1963 at the age of 90. Thomas Ames was born on December 17, 1872, and in his trust, he left money to be used to build a hospital in Crystal Lake. If a hospital was not built within 20 years of his death, the money was to be given to an organization that would benefit the city of Crystal Lake. Many groups petitioned for the money, but the Home State Bank trustees awarded it to the library. Our Thomas Ames meeting room is named in his honor. The Ames family farm was located on Route 31, north of Terracotta Industries. The Rasmussen family were friends of the Ames family. Earl Rasmussen painted a picture of the Ames family farm. That picture is now owned by the library. Henry Rasmussen, Earl's brother, lived on Paddock Street, just down the street from the library. One day when Thomas Ames was visiting Henry's home, he looked across the street toward the library and said he hoped that the library wouldn't always have to be such a little cracker box. His trust money has helped to build the library that we have today. The library board allocated the money to be used in 3 different categories: facilities, collection, and equipment. A portion of the equipment money was used to begin computerization of the library in 1989. Catherine Martins became the library director in 1990. But before that, I wanted to show you a picture from the paper. Someone mailed to the library a book that was overdue, along with 4 $100 bills in the mail, and a little note. They didn't name themselves, though, but they did return the book and the fines that they thought what the fines would add up to. This is a picture of Kim Martins, our current director. She came in 1990. The city of Crystal Lake continued to grow, and another expansion project began in 1995. This two-story beacon area of the library added 13,000 square feet. There's a picture of it under construction. There's a close-up. And that's what it looks like today. This addition increased the library size to 40,000 square feet, the size it is today. The dedication for the new addition was held on March 8, 1998. There's another picture of the building. This is a picture of Miss Flanders in 1995 at the grand opening, along with Nancy Myers, who was head of the Youth Services Department, and Jim Wright, who was one of our board members. As the city grew, the library again became overcrowded. From 1984 to 2004, the population of Crystal Lake increased to 38,000 residents, and use of library services more than doubled. Yet the library building increased in size by only 48%. In 2004, a referendum was issued for a bigger library building. Unfortunately, the referendum was defeated. The citizens of Crystal Lake wanted the library to stay at the current site and make do with what they had. Project Shoehorn resulted from the residents' message. In 2007, the library building was reworked. The children's department was moved to the lower level, and the entire adult department was moved to the first level. Compact shelving was added to help manage the library's growing collection. Project Shoehorn was a temporary answer, and it was planned to give the library another 5 to 8 years without a major expansion. Our library is 40,000 square feet. And finally, 2013 was an epic year for the Crystal Lake Library, an enduring place in the community. This is Kim's note in the Beacon at the beginning in January of 1913. We held a couple of major events, which thousands of people were able to attend. More than 28,000 residents of Crystal Lake have public library cards. We circulated more than 1 million items last year. 900 residents living outside the city limits purchase library cards. And on average, 30,000 people walk into the library every month. Twice we've been recognized by the Hennons organization as one of the top 25 libraries for its size. The library collection consists of over 170,000 books. Remember 100 years ago we had 200 books? Nearly 28,000 DVDs, 6,800 CD books, 13,000 CDs, and more. It's wonderful to have so many material resources available to the citizens of Crystal Lake, but the library is more than buildings. Kim Martins, our director, has been at the library longer than any other director. She has directed us through a large addition project in 1995 and Project Shoehorn's reorganization. We have 79 employees, 22 full-time and 57 part-time. The library is here today because of the efforts of caring and hard-working individuals for the past 100 years. And we'll spend the next 100 years striving to fulfill our mission statement, helping people of all ages and backgrounds learn, enjoy, and better their lives. Thank you. Question? They would just go from door to door and ask for money. That's pretty much that's all that we can figure out from the articles that have been in the paper. That's all we can figure out. Maybe. I don't know, to tell you the truth. We had that little article, but it didn't tell you a whole lot. What boys? Oh. That would be great. Yes. When the radio came, they said that was going to hurt everything. When TV came, that was going to hurt everything. There's uses for everything. If you're flying on a plane and you just want to have one thing with you and have 3 or 4 books that you can read, you can carry your iPad. You don't have to carry all those books. So there's a use for everything. Uh-huh. Good. Make the most of the space that we had. Yep. Right. Yep. Also, there's bookmarks for the 100th anniversary. We put together a series of bookmarks. One new one came out every year of different things that happened in the library's history. So you're welcome to take their clip together there, and you're welcome to take them if you'd like. And there's also library pencils. We bring library pencils everywhere. Arden? Uh-huh. Yeah. I grew up in Crystal Lake, so I lived in the library as a kid, and then in the 80s when Arden was there, I was on the Friends of the Library at that time. And then now I've worked there for 22 years, so it's a great place, yeah. 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 what I've done is I've brought, Kim had in the September-October 2013 Library Beacon newsletter, she wrote a little article about what's going on right now, and I knew somebody might have a question about what we're doing. So what is happening with the new library building? It's a question I get from community members. And over a year ago, in the July-August 2012 Beacon, I reported to you the current phase, planning and schematic design, will take 4 to 6 months and involve more planning, engineering, and further development of the concept into a schematic design. While analysis and engineering are going on, other groups of people will be working on the funding. How do we bring the costs down? Are there other grants or foundations to supplement funding? How much money can be raised through private donations? What will the cost be to the average resident of Crystal Lake? In the fall of 2012, the Crystal Lake City Council gave the library board an assignment to investigate all options, including relocating the library building to another part of the building and potentially utilizing a vacant building. So what is involved for this type of investigation and analysis? First, what size space does our community need for the 21st century? For a 21st century technology-based public library facility. Based on information gathered during a comprehensive needs assessment in 2011 and the subsequent draft space needs document by Anders Dahlgren of Library Planning Associates, the following represents the minimum/maximum parameters for a future site. Minimum 4.6 acres, which would allow for a 75,000 square foot building with 225 parking spaces. The maximum 7.7 acres, which would allow for an 85,000 square foot building and 382 parking spaces. In addition, the Library Board's Building Committee is using the following evaluation factors as they consider all potential sites for the public library building: location, site size, building layout, useful building height, adaptability, access/parking, control of site, ease of construction, amenities, and 10 other site attributes. The library board is still in the process of evaluating sites for a new library. Over the years, we have received a great deal of feedback from the community to stay at our current location on Paddock Street. The total land we own here is limited, which has driven up the costs of that solution. As stewards of public money, we have to ask what is the best solution, and they're still looking into that. So I don't have any answers.